Thank you, Jessica. So in today's meeting, we will, I'll give a quick discussion recap talking about the discussions that we've had so far. And then I'll turn it over to our two presenters today. Will Micklin of the Iwaipai tribe, Iwaipai band of the Kumeyaay Indians in Alpine, California, and Josh Simmons representing Prosper Sustainably, who is contracting with and doing the tribal gap analysis project. We'll have Q&A after each presentation and some additional Q&A for questions that might come up after the presentations, and hopefully some robust conversation and discussion. Next slide, please. So in these discussions, we've been, again, I just want to remind people that we've been somewhat stepping outside of our regulatory box by setting aside the procedural next steps just for now, and trying to just think about what the rational approach is for thinking about the issues and planning for them. So as we work through that rational approach, we can come back to the question of process and what's the role for the states, the tribes, local governments, various agencies, and what the role of ratepayer funding is. As a review of the material we've covered in previous discussions, we in our first meeting provided an overview of the Resiliency Evaluation Toolkit that provides a scalable, sequential methodology by which resiliency can be assessed, mitigation measures can be compared and optimized, and resiliency responses can be assessed for effectiveness, and resiliency efforts can be incrementally improved. In subsequent meetings, we discussed each pillar more in depth. So within the baseline assessment pillar, we talked about mapping out critical infrastructure, critical facilities, essential services, and social demographics. Using this place-based awareness, resiliency targets can be chosen and prioritized, and then the metrics selected that would indicate later whether those targets are being met. An all-hazard assessment clarifies what threatens those resilience targets, and a gap analysis shows how well the current systems are performing or might perform in response to those threats to reach those targets. In the second pillar, mitigation measure assessments, after mapping out our baseline considerations, we looked at what options exist that might better reach our resiliency targets, taking into consideration their performance under locationally relevant hazard events, and paying attention to what part of the resiliency trapezoid the mitigation measure might affect. So within this assessment pillar, we looked at what the costs are in relationship to the measure's ability to respond to the pertinent hazard events to meet resilience targets. In the third pillar, we talked about the potential for a resiliency scorecard as a tool to provide a mechanism for comparing resiliency solution configurations that recognizes a basic benchmark of reaching resiliency target achievement and what contribution to state policy goals the configuration might be meeting, and provides a mechanism for assessing improvement that is available to the configuration. In the fourth pillar, resiliency response assessment, we talked about the need to look at how well post-disruption did the implemented mitigation measures do in reaching those resiliency targets. Did the investments reduce the impacts on the community? Are there further improvements we can make to better reach our goals? We've also heard presentations on tools that help understand the indirect costs of electricity interruption, how to optimize investments to balance reliability and resiliency goals, as well as a tool called RenCat that uses equity data as a foundational layer to provide insight into the best areas to locate resilience resources in order to decrease the social burden of outages on ratepayers. In the last workshop, we heard from Paul Cummings from Nevada County Office of Emergency Planning on what on-the-ground resiliency considerations look like from the local government perspective. As mentioned in the agenda, today we'll be hearing about the tribal nation resiliency perspectives. I'm going to turn it over now to Will Micklin of the Iwaipai band of the Kumeyaay Indians in Alpine, California.
Thank you. My name is Will Micklin. I'm CEO for the Woypipe Band of Kumeyaay Indians. Our chair is Robert Pinto Sr. We are a federally recognized tribe in East San Diego County in Southern California. And so we can go to the next slide. So you see here is a map of the state of California and the 110 tribes within it. We are one of the many tribes in San Diego County, 17 tribes, and quite a few more in the rest of Southern California. So we experience, along with a significant amount of other tribes, a electricity gap, electrification gap for our tribal lands. And still today, there are, as was reported by the U.S. Energy Information Administration in 2000, about 14% of households on reservation lands have no access to electricity, and that's in compared to 1.4% of households nationally. That gap is actually larger when you include underserved, which means unreliable, non-robust energy or power provided to households and anchor institutions. And that's not well quantified or documented and is outside of the typical American's perspective that the norm in this country is that all households have access to reliable electricity. So on the next slide, I present a regional view. This is part of East County. So on the right, you'll see the main part of the reservation reserved from original Indian lands, which is only a small percentage of the tribe's Aboriginal lands. It's 5,460 acres. That's dominated by 3 ridge lines. It's a narrow valley. It's about 1% of the reservation is arable. The rest are steep, 40% grade ridge lines, reservations at between 5,000 and 6,400 feet. And it's accessed by a 12-mile dirt road that's unmaintained over half its distance and is subject to erosion and closure with periodic seasonal storms. We're only about 30 miles east of San Diego, and yet we experience many snow days, icing days, and severe rainstorms and high wind duration events. It can get up to 30 meters per second on sustained wind events in that location. So our plan all along has been to address that the reservation is off-grid. We're off-grid to the electrical transmission system, the IOU, serving San Diego Gas and Electric, and we're off-grid to all telecommunication services, including mobile, radio, and cellular services. So our project is assisted by our recent acquisition of a 2.5 gigahertz radio spectrum license with the FCC, that because of wildland fire risks in the area require underground conduit, which is a great opportunity to co-locate electrical conductor with the underground broadband facilities media. So in the next slide, you'll see the proposed route for the underground conduit originating in the Glencliff substation in the community, unincorporated community in East County of Mount Laguna, and extending about 3 miles into the tribal community. It's an expensive proposition. It's over $1 million a mile for underground conduit, plus maintenance road costs, plus any mitigation or remediation that may be required from the environmental document that would look at the actual build out of the facilities. But this is our proposal to electrify the reservation and the hope to co-locate the broadband conductor and solve those deficiencies which have plagued the reservation since the lands were reserved back in 1891. So you'll see in the next slide that there are significant energy potential on tribal lands in the U.S. And you'll see an accounting on this slide of all the different potential production on tribal lands, and it's supported by the Energy Policy Act of 1992, 2005, and the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. So all of these intend to facilitate production, both distributed generation as well as all the way to commercial scale generation. So the intention is certainly there. The problem has been in implementation. And so you'll see on the next slide the status of Indian energy, that we continue to have a problem in particularly in rural and remote communities, which is the substantial supermajority of tribes in the United States are thus situated similar to the Woody Pipe Reservation. And that where we are electrified, we are subject to high cost energy, or we're off the grid entirely. So the intention is to transition to distributed renewable energy production with microgrid systems interconnected in regional energy sheds by 2030. Now, energy shed is a term that Department of Energy is now promoting. That means that it's the geographical area in which all power consumed within it is supplied within it. And a energy shed management system are whatever tools or processes that oversee the grid operations within the geographical boundaries of the energy shed. The only addition that Indian country tribes in the US are promoting with Department of Energy in this energy shed concept is that these energy sheds be interconnected, that the intelligence in community microgrids are extended to nearby tribal lands or to independent operators like San Diego Gas and Electric or Edison or Pacific Gas and Electric to provide the benefits of both feed-in tariffs, the SCHIP program with the state of California is certainly one that we intend to participate in, as well as load balancing for power shutoff events and where flex events are required. So to do this really takes a tiering of energy technologies for the energy shed production within communities. And so that includes solar, wind, geothermal. Tribes are not as enamored with biomass just because of the implication that biomass is a renewable resource when in most tribal areas it's not renewable. And we're intending to protect our woodlands and forests for reforestation and restoration to indigenous habitat, and biomass can work against that. But as well, gasification projects are important to us. So waste to energy, because solid waste is a huge problem in tribal communities because of the cost of backhaul to remove solid waste from communities, as well as the consequences of what is predominantly bioaccumulative toxins that persist within our communities and have significant adverse impacts on our public health. So these, we think the solutions are with energy sheds and microgrids, where we can provide the connection within these systems and manage them with the intelligence that is adaptable and responsive to the capacity that tribes have on hand. And in many locations, when I talk about administrative capacity, I'm talking about tribal officials that wear many hats. They may run the microgrid. They may be responsible for maintaining, if not repairing, solar panels and solar battery arrays, and all the way to the inverter, to the backup systems that we are steadily trying to replace our diesel and propane generators with battery and rechargeable battery generators. So you see on the next slide, the recommendations that tribes are proposing to our federal partners and to state government, which is seeking to affect a reduction in the regulatory burdens that diminish our opportunity to achieve our goals, and to provide, to make productive the tribal trust estate. And I use that term intentionally. That is a trust responsibility of our trustee in the government-to-government relationship, which is to make productive the tribal trust estate. And oftentimes the interests of federal agencies and departments go against that interest because they're protecting their own parochial interests. And those are things that must submit to the overarching trust responsibility. So our recommendations are, and this is somewhat federally focused, but I think is towards the end, you'll see how applicable it is to state issues between tribes and state governments, is trust modernization. And that really speaks to addressing the complexity and inflexibility of administrative bureaucracy that has as its first goal protecting the territorial and jurisdictional authority of that department. And oftentimes tribal interests suffer as a result. GAO addressed that in one of their many analyses, which may provide some further information. So we need certainty with our decision makers. There are really very few, if any, deadlines to federal decision making when it comes to adjudicating tribal interests. And so waiting indefinitely for a response from our federal partners makes inviable many of our plans and programs to remedy our deficiencies in access to reliable, robust, and lower cost or affordable energy. I addressed the electrification issue in my, I think in my description for the Weed Pipe Reservation's electrification project. And so on the next slide, we'll go to the Nepa issues. So we have significant Nepa issues simply because any decision by the federal trustee is interpreted to be to trigger Nepa because it implicates the nexus between tribes and the federal government as a significant action. And this really goes against the CEQ definition for CADEX, which I think in CEQA is a negative declaration. And there are so many projects that should be CADEX that would provide an expedient path to implementing the programs that the Congress funds with the intention to provide relief to tribes, and we run up against environmental issues. So these are things that really need attention because NEPA does not intend it, but in the interpretation and the application of NEPA by each federal agency under CEQ guidelines, there is manifest a problem with the actual application of the guidelines to tribal projects. Recommendation 4 is, I think, evidences that that issue in permitting. So most times energy projects on tribal lands are not entirely restricted to within the boundaries of tribal lands or reservations. Oftentimes and optimally, we need connectivity to the grid or a connection between non-contiguous tribal parcels. And in doing that, we must seek permits. And because we are often bounded by federal public lands or state lands, if we're talking about CEQA, similar to NEPA, we need permits for transmission across those lands, for towers on those federal public lands, just really to get connectivity, which is so beneficial to our energy projects. And again, we run up against these problems. REPIPE has been denied permits for energy and for transportation access to our reservation simply because the Forest Service will fail us in the initial screening because the project would cross the Pacific Crest Trail and cause a aesthetic visual impact to folks on the Pacific Crest Trail. And we understand the opposition to hikers, but we think that the federal trust responsibility should supersede those issues of aesthetic impact, particularly for when we can remediate that with particular measures. So the other impact is just seen generally in that there is really no current production on Forest Service lands of renewable energy projects. I know of one in the east that is near the end of a record of decision, but frankly, that compares badly to the objectives established in the White House, in the Congress, in each department that promotes the type of projects that would benefit tribes and achieve our goals. And zero production, I think, represents that there are hurdles that we have not yet been able to overcome. And there we have some very specific recommendations on permitting, again, that don't imperil the impacts or make worse impacts on the human environment, but provide the particularly access to energy that our communities need, that we think are achievable, but not yet achieved. So on the next slide, we come to our final recommendation of the 5 is dual taxation. Tribes are still subject to the imposition of state and local government assessment and collection of taxes particularly on assets or improvements subject to possessory interest tax and sales tax from revenues generated by third parties on tribal lands. So tribes are exempt from taxation, but non-tribal entities that operate on the reservation are subject to that. And that is a huge and pervasive problem. It inhibits projects all the way from distributed generation all the way to commercial for-profit energy production, because a high percentage of the available revenues are lost to tribal government who provides no services on the reservation, nor do the revenues collected. They go up to the state capital and then back down to local government. Is any of that shared with tribal lands? And you'll see on the side here an illustration of project financials, and in that I think you'll appreciate that 35% of potential revenue from a commercial revenue, for-profit revenue energy production project on tribal lands is lost from dual taxation that goes to state and local government entities, and really makes them infeasible and unviable. So The next slide addresses the 4-pillar methodology for each one. So in pillar 1, the base assessment, I think what I've tried to articulate in my presentation is that we have a high percentage of off-grid communities, tribal communities, many which have unreliable energy. I know in my, I'm Tlingit from Southeast Alaska, so our communities often are wary about plugging in expensive electronics into our home systems because we'll get surges and it will destroy very expensive components very quickly. There's a high cost for grid connectivity, and frankly, there's very little appropriations for electrification if you're not connected to the grid. There's an assumption that everyone that needs to be connected is connected, and that's just simply not true for Indian country. The baseline, our baseline experience is that most of those funds appropriated, generally through loans, but sometimes through grants, have oftentimes, in most every instance, required a 20 to 50% tribal match. And frankly, the substantial supermajority of tribes just don't have discretionary funds to apply to those kind of matches. And the additional cost in the complexity of preparing applications is significant and very costly. And that's why you'll see that most of those projects and those applications are filled by tribes with available enterprise revenues, which is oftentimes a large casino. And every other tribe that doesn't have that benefit is unable to prepare and benefit from those programs. And the result is a lot of money is turned back to Congress that should be applied to tribes. And when Congress sees that money coming back, they think, oh, we don't need it. And so we always have a problem in trying to keep up appropriations for these programs that are inhibited from us taking them on just because of the cost and complexity of application. So bonding's an issue, our inability to monetize tax credits. We talked about dual taxation. So all of this list is the long baseline assessment of why we are where we are. And hopefully that you can appreciate that it's not through lack of effort or advocacy, it's just that not enough has changed for the challenges which obstruct us from achieving these goals. So the next page is slide is the mitigation measures. And so this is what we advocate for. We advocate for electrification. We look for support for co-location of energy connectivity and distributed generation along with broadband deployment, frankly, because broadband can't be successfully deployed without reliable energy. We advocate for a zero cost of the non-federal share of the tribal match, and the other removing the barriers to the other issues I mentioned. So I won't go through it again because these are all sort of the responses to the prior baseline, which I think are clear in here, including the Buy Indian Act. So energy production, tribes should be able to sell theirs. And unfortunately, we have problems with the Buy Indian Act and particularly the prevailing rate for what is a competitive price, where too often our local regional production is compared to the cost of hydro in the Northwest, and it's not helpful. So the next page is the Resiliency Scorecard. It's really about quantification and evaluation. And we think that 100% distributed generation of renewable energy through the diverse technologies that I mentioned is a relevant goal for 2030. And tribes are making decisions today in the context of climate change, resiliency, and adaptation to the impacts of climate change. And we believe the target should be 2030 for the infrastructure, which has the long-term requirements for build out, that can keep us on track for those impacts which any country feels first and most in this country. We'd like to replace our vehicles with electric vehicles. Again, I addressed the energy shed concept with the connectivity in regional connectivity, and the addition of the different technologies in support, and even up to hydrogen. And I think there are some great uses for hydrogen where any country can participate, and tariffs to support this. We have SGIP in California, and we have programs for microgrid support. Those are excellent. And the CPUC has been very responsive to these issues, and the legislature is in the process of funding these types of programs. But we are at particular risk because of what is going to happen from now until the foreseeable future, which is wildland fire hazard, drought, and high temperature, excessive heat. And those are things that only reliable energy systems can help address. And tribes can be a significant component in helping to address these issues. In the state, as the Blue Lake Rancheria in Humboldt County has already proven with their microgrid system. And the next page is the final slide, which is resiliency assessment. We just need to be able to implement these assessments so that we can determine what's affordable, what's reliable, how we can support what we believe is the rule from now on, which is our economy has become a dispersed economy since the effects of the pandemic. And with the climate change adaptation, that means more loads, electric loads, and longer time of day demands on energy production for our communities as well as others. And again, I think tribes can help support that. I mentioned co-location and energy sheds, and just that this has to be sustainable and has to be valued by the ratepayer, including ours, tribal citizen subscribers, to be successful and to be responsive to what we think is an overarching priority, which are the risks of climate change. So that's my presentation, and ready for any Q&A. Thank you.
Sorry, man, it seems like I'm having a little bit of a slow response to my system here. I am looking for questions. I'm not sure my Q&A is working completely, but I do see a raised hand.
I'm going to stop the recording right now.
Great.
Robert Peterson, I'm going to unmute you. I'm not sure if that's the same question you had in the Q&A.
That worked. What was the last thing you said, Jessica?
Oh, I'm going to unmute you now, so you're now live.
Oh, yeah,
I wasn't
great.
sure if you have the same question as you did in the Q&A, but please ask your question.
Oh yeah, no. The question is about the dual taxation, and so I wanted to get some more clarity on that. It's very interesting, and so can that be resolved by state action alone, or is there a federal action related to that?
So there's been significant federal action in litigation and court precedent, which always doesn't quite address the key issues of incidence of tax and the jurisdiction, because the test over time has really changed. The federal test used to be balancing the interest of the tribe, and since probably since the 1980s, the test has been balancing the interests of the state and its subdivisions. And we always seem to lose on that test. The resolution is certainly in state capitals where they can determine that they will not impose assessment and collection on tribal lands at their discretion. We are seeking more affirmation from our federal partners to try and assert the full exemption. And we've had some success with the Hearth Act, but that pertains only to leasing. The test of that is still, I think, yet to be fully known how dispositive that regulation is. So yeah, the state legislature could be enormously helpful in determining that that state and local government will not impose taxes on tribal lands, irrespective of the incidence of tax being on a tribal government or subdivision or a non-tribal entity operating on the tribal lands.
Great. And can I ask another follow-up question? Do we have time for that?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, great. So in taking the example on slide 16, there's a wind farm project. And so if a wind developer was to come in, the idea is that when the tribe paid for the windmills, they would also pay sales tax to the state. Is that what that means?
So thanks for the question. For commercial scale, and this is really referencing a commercial scale utility project for a wind energy conversion project. The one this references is a 202 megawatt with 51 megawatts through tribal participation through a federal business lease of a portion of tribal lands for that part of the array that would cross tribal lands. And so the under the lease agreement, the enterprise or the actual assets and production is owned by the developer, who pays lease rent and a percentage of revenues as participatory rent to the tribe, and the tribe seeks to collect tax on sales and possessory interest tax on the value of the improvements on the reservation. Today, the county, the local government, assesses on both sales tax and possessory interest tax. And so we have not prevailed in litigation on those matters to date.
And are there any workarounds that are possible? So let's say the entity was a tribal entity that was developing wind turbines, not windmills. Would that mean that these taxes might not apply?
So I think there's a reasonable conclusion that if the entity that owns the assets that is liable for the incident and bears the incidence of tax is a tax exempt tribal entity, then that would not be successfully taxed by state and local government. Of course, that would require resources that right now I'm trying to think of a tribe which could do that. And there's maybe a couple. MHA has oil and gas enterprises that they own. So they still are losing tax to sales tax to their state and local government.
We just saw in the news that I believe the Morongo band bought a transmission line. And I wonder if another reservation or tribe developed this expertise and had the capabilities, and they developed it on another tribe's properties, could it still be tax exempt? So like if you had assistance from a different tribe.
Yeah, Chairman Martin is well known in tribal circles for his sophistication and has really brought Morongo to new heights. So that's an example of rights of way for infrastructure facilities that were negotiated certainly long before Chairman Martin, and often without the participation of the tribe. So in the past, before the 1990s, and even up to then, the Bureau of Indian Affairs negotiated for the tribe without tribal participation, and the tribe became aware that they were then subject to these long-term agreements at very low rates, that they had no opportunity to change. So Morongo was fortunate enough to have enough discretionary income from, if you've been by there, you know where they got it from, to be able to purchase those facilities and be the landlord to these assets. So there's a few tribes that are in that position and are certainly moving to that. For every other tribe, they're working hard to gain control over these rights of ways that exist on many reservations, but were put in place without their approval or participation, that they now seek to monetize.
Thank you.
Robert Peterson, if you don't mind lowering your hand. Thank you so much. Roseanne, I don't see any other raised hands on my end.
I don't either, and I'm not sure if I'm seeing all the Q&A. So if you have, let me just put it out there that if you have entered a question in the Q&A, could you raise your hand? Because I seem to be able to see those, but I'm not seeing Q&A.
I see the Q&A. I don't see a question.
I see one question, which was from Robert.
Yeah.
I do see Georgia Reed has a question, so maybe
Great,
unmute
thank you.
Georgia.
Yep, I'm gonna do that right now. Georgia, you're muted.
Hi, good afternoon, all. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Micklin, I would love to hear you expand your take on biomass energy and just where that is coming from. And yeah, simple question. That's it.
So yeah, and so my observation on biomass is one, it is an available energy source, which is by custom and tradition used predominantly by tribes in their traditional way. The reservations currently circulating in tribal communities is just about the commercial application of biomass and its effect on the priority for the reforestation and restoration of indigenous habitats, where because of the long replacement cycle for these, particularly the hardwood and softwood trees and their supporting flora, that we are seeking to try and de-emphasize that as a commercial opportunity, but still reserve it for our customary and traditional use. So I hope that gets to the focus of your question.
Yes, if I may follow up, would you agree or disagree that in areas such as the Northwest or perhaps Alaska, where there's excess fuel loads, wildfire risk, and a lot of ongoing thinning, that I know this, I'm sensitive to this being different on reservation lands than general federal lands. So I suppose that's where your answer lies, is in the specific resources that tribal lands are allotted. Is that correct?
Yeah, and we're particularly sensitive to old growth. So we are now, for instance, in the Southeast Alaska, entering into are working on agreements with the Forest Service to reserve old growth for traditional indigenous use. In our instance, totem poles, cedar, bark collection, and medicinal plant use and native foods. And so that is our priority, and we are looking at the roadless rule return to its the content of it when issued in 2001, not because we think that's the right outcome, and this applies to harvesting in California as well as in Alaska, but because we feel that we have not been listened to when we, for each community, advocate to the decision makers about cuts, about timber cuts and harvesting and the like, where our indigenous knowledge informs us about how to approach that, and we don't think our federal partner listens, and we get into outcomes where there are single species that predominate, that the indigenous habitat is compromised, and we suffer for it. So we're not trying to diminish that the use of timber and other flora for particularized uses, but just that we want to be listened to, and we want our indigenous knowledge to be treated on equal footing with Western science, mostly because we think our experience prevails over what has been in very much predominates to date of single species science, where it's a very insular stovepipe look at particular species or habitats without regard to the real synergy within the entire ecosystem and watershed. And so that's what we're trying to promote, more than we're trying to inhibit use of the woodland resource.
Excellent. I hear you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Georgia, just for our records, could you tell me what your organization is from?
Absolutely. Am I now unmuted? There we go. My name is Georgia Reed. I'm calling in with Wisewood Energy. We are a biomass developer in the West, and I was invited by our other employee, Ali DeTrio.
Thank you. I see another raised hand from Jose Lopez Gallego.
Hi, yes. Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity. This is a question related to technology. We are a company in Southern California. We represent manufacturers of providers of technology, and sometimes this technology is related to microgrids or hydrogen production, energy storage. So we have a interesting portfolio that I think could be applicable to many of the cases that Will was explaining. So the question is that these technologies are not always straightforward comparable with what's mainstream. We have some advantages and differences, and it requires some explanation to the possible user of these technologies before they can even think about incorporating them, because in some cases is as I was saying, is different than what exists. So my question is, how or where or who should we address to try to explain these technologies and see if there's a possible fit for any of the projects that the tribes may have? I don't know if I'm explaining myself. Sorry if it didn't come out.
So I don't know if I'm not the right person to answer the contact issue, but I'll just take a minute to support your proposition that many of the energy technologies that tribes are looking to don't have a apples to apples comparison to what is the normative solutions for energy deficiencies. And we also see that in the public utility formulas that drive the funding for these types of technologies. And I'm referring to support for feed-in tariffs and self-generation programs and the like, where the use of variables like avoided costs in those formulas we think is not really on point when we're trying to quantify and value the beneficial impact of what are substantially different approaches, and where capital cost at the outset is a substantial benefit when you're able to value and the expense of other events, like power shutdowns, like wildfire events, like excessive heat and the high cost of energy in the long term, where the systems, when there's additional capital contribution on the front end, can remediate and reduce those impacts that would otherwise exist, but are not part of the formula for determining what's in the current term a viable opportunity. So I'll let others answer about who to address that to, but we think that's a valuable topic for discussion about how to quantify and value diverse technologies and systems.
We've got one more raised hand. Jose, if you could lower your hand, that would be great.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay.
Roseanne, I'll just add one more response to that, just because I had a little bit of success. I'm working on a tribal project and connecting with some new technology providers, and I think the CEC probably appreciate it, but their platform, empowerinnovation.net, is intended to be a forum to allow new technology, emerging technology providers connect with not just tribes, but other communities as well. So I think it, tends to revolve around the CEC's grants, but they advertise also, pretty much any grant that's relevant. So I have at least used it successfully on one occasion. So that may be something you want to look into. empowerinnovation.net.
And I think this is a great lead into introducing you, Josh. Thank you, Will, for your presentation. Rob Peterson, I know you have your hand raised again. Is it possible? Oh, okay. You just brought it down. So let's move on to Josh Simmons' presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Josh, I'm going to give you the presenter role. And I'm going to start recording.
Okay, can you see my slides right now? Because it blocks the, actually, let me pull this over so I can still see it. Are you seeing my screen yet? Or let's see.
Not yet.
There we go. So thanks everybody. I appreciate being invited to come speak here. Rosanna, really appreciate having spoken with you over the past month or so, and I appreciate you also putting Will in front of me, because I actually think it was a good judgment on your part. I think it was great to hear from him first, and I think we bring different perspectives on this, and he fleshes out some things that I don't necessarily need to go into as much detail, may not be quite as informed on, and can then focus on some other areas a bit more. So I am the president and founder of Prosper Sustainably. So I'm a licensed attorney in California and got my master's at UCSB. I was the former environmental director for the St. Annes Chumash before I started prosper, and started the business when I left there. So we are a small women-owned business, and we primarily provide energy, climate, and resiliency and environmental consulting services for tribes and other communities. We do this, we kind of do projects soup to nuts, grant writing, project and program planning, project management, working on a variety of energy, climate, and resilience planning and other projects. The three of our largest clients that we're working with under a Strategic Growth Council challenge grant, and among other variety of other projects are the Paul Band of Mission Indians, the Rincon Band of Luis Sueño Indians, and San Pasqual Band of Mission Indians. So these are all located near the Huipai in San Diego County, and that's actually where I went to law school at University of San Diego, and a lot of most of our clients, most of our work actually is predominantly in that area, but San Diego County is actually has more tribes, federally recognized tribes, than any county in the U.S. I believe. So we're also, yep.
Josh, I want to just interrupt. If you are showing slides, we are not seeing them.
Oh, sorry about that. Great. All right, so you're seeing them now, right? Sorry about that.
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Let's select the screen. So as Roseanne mentioned, Prosper is the lead on the California Tribal Energy and Climate Change Gap Analysis, where we are seeking to identify and address gaps in the areas of clean energy and climate change adaptation and resilience for tribes throughout California, not just those with federal recognition, but those that do not have federal recognition, which is, I believe, approximately 170 or 180 tribes throughout California. We are also collaborating with the Paul Band of Mission Indians on an ongoing basis and implementing the Tribal Climate Health Project, and worked with Paula too on implementing the Pollution Prevention Action Project. And these projects are focused on regional and national capacity building in the areas of energy, climate change, and just a variety of environmental topics. We also are working, we do clean tech consulting with various groups as well. Some companies, and actually in one case a nonprofit, working on a newer solar panel technology and kind of, I guess, for lack of a better word, business model. But in one instance, we're working with Swell Energy as their tribal liaison and advisor, and working with tribes and helping to bring the S-chip opportunity to tribes. Typically, Prosper does not. We are usually in the role of owner's representative, and engineer on a variety of projects for tribes and for local governments. And this was a unique circumstance due to the S-chip opportunity and the equity resilience funding that was offered by the CPUC and being administered by the IOUs and Center for Sustainable Energy, that it just was resulting in pretty much free battery storage systems or energy storage systems for tribes. And so Swell was one of the leading energy storage providers in California. And so we just saw something where the money was going to be limited. It was available to everybody, and we want to do our best to get the funding to tribes and these systems to tribes to meet their resiliency needs as much as possible before the money runs out. And in PG&E territory and SDG&E territory, actually in Edison, those territories, as of right now, in equity resilience, the funding's all dried up. So I mentioned the California Tribal Gap Analysis Project and some of the goals. And so we're seeking, through identifying the tribe's priorities, needs, and barriers in the areas of clean energy and climate change, to then provide recommendations for state programs, funding, and technical assistance, and other resources to address the identified needs. So these are, the tribes are identifying their needs, and the results of this analysis are intended to inform future state investments to help tribes address these specific needs. There's 110 federally recognized tribes, 60, 70 tribes without federal recognition throughout the state, and there's a very wide diversity in perspectives and needs. And so, we're doing our best to identify and share. And so the report from this project will be coming out. Should be a draft available in the fall to early winter, and then the final report should be available by or spring of next year. So if there are any tribes on the line, definitely if you've not heard about this project, I hope you'll go to caltribalgapanalysis.org and to learn more, potentially register your tribe. So I think Will did a great job of talking about specifics with regards to tribal resiliency considerations, and particularly with respect to the 4 pillars methodology that the CPUC is working on developing right now. So I've just kind of walked through, I believe, some of what's already been covered, but I think what's really been driving this for the tribes we've been working with are the increasing impacts are leading to an increasing importance of resiliency, the increasing amounts of wildfires and the extent of the wildfires that are occurring throughout the state and beyond, the PSPS outages that are regular and increasing in occurrence that are shutting down these communities for hours, days, and weeks at a time, the more extreme storm events that are leading to flooding, mudslides, landslides, the extreme periods of droughts, the disappearance and migration of species, rising energy costs, and just a whole host of things that are particularly impacting tribes in the rural communities that they're working that they where they live. And so this is it's by it can't be ignored. So I've seen it working with tribes. I'm really back since 1999, but more recently since 2007 when I started working with the Chumash when I finished school, that just the emphasis on these types of projects is substantially increased. And then working with tribes, there's the unique aspect of working with tribes with their sovereignty, the historic injustices, the in some cases lack of trust, the unique economic situation where they're not, unlike non-tribal communities where there's a tax basis, tribes are relying upon revenue streams from other sources or lack thereof. There's program ineligibility, whether it's the investment tax credit or the various tax incentives that are helping to fund resiliency, microgrid, and other types of projects. I pull up my notes on the side for a few more examples of these. There can be, ineligibility for funding opportunities. There can be, match requirements that a tribe can't meet, and Will pointed that out as well. I do appreciate that the CPUC and the CEC have been trying to emphasize tribal eligibility for various programs more and not requiring eligibility to go through something like Cal EnviroScreen. That doesn't really seem to account for the uniqueness of tribal communities, and therefore they're where they should otherwise be seen as a disadvantaged community or determined not to be a disadvantaged community, and therefore are not eligible or have less eligibility or have to overcome some insurmountable obstacles where there's just no data to support their eligibility for certain programs. But we've seen with SGIP where the CPUC has across the board categorized tribal lands as eligible lands under the DAC status. And on the microgrids proceeding is also another instance where that's occurring as well, and hopefully we see more of that. Will mentioned indigenous or traditional knowledges being the basis of decision making, or certainly a very large factor in decision making processes. It's not something that's typically considered outside of Native cultures and communities. And so, that's just something that makes it, both unique and challenging, and also presents some opportunities as well. I find that I enjoy working with tribal communities because tribal governments tend to have a greater degree of control over the resources and their assets. Obviously there can be challenges and regulatory restrictions and constraints, or just gray areas coming from both the federal and state sides, and Will touched upon these, and I'll touch upon them a bit more as well. But if you work with a local government, you're typically working with them and providing services and programs for the community that's not as connected or interconnected, intertwined as a tribal community is. So I'm working on projects where we're working down on the ground level with people in their homes to working on the laws and regulations and everything in between. So it can present some exciting and unique opportunities, which not just for the tribes, but for the communities and agencies and partners trying to work with tribes as well to do great things together. But it sometimes requires a certain level of flexibility that there can be challenging to overcome. So there's also the consideration of the capacities and the resources versus need, and Will talked about the more few and far between resource-rich tribes that have gaming or other operations that are bringing in significant or at least some level of revenues that allow them to pursue these opportunities, and the vast majority of the tribes that do not have these resources to be able to hire somebody such as myself to support grant writing or project management, or to kind of get that ball rolling. I've had a lot of success actually in getting some initial seed funding, and that leads to a lot more funding that leads to lower or less tribal investments into some of these needed resources for microgrid or renewable energy projects or otherwise. But some of that investment required hiring legal counsel and others, or making some investment that then allows them to take advantage of opportunities and that make the projects more cost effective, that are just an insurmountable obstacle for those tribes that just don't have those initial resources to get that ball rolling and be able to then take advantage of those opportunities. So tribes, when we're talking about resiliency, it's a newer concept. Tribes more and more have environmental departments that and other departments that everybody's wearing multiple hats, and working with the Chumash as their environmental director, I experienced this as well, where we were overseeing their environmental programs. We kind of were doing public works type projects and the tribal government. We're working in so many different areas, and so you have kind of a single person or a few people wearing so many hats that are spread so thin that it's challenging for them to really fully consider and take advantage of these opportunities or address these needs. So we talked about funding, and then policies and regulations too. It's even following the microgrids proceeding, I believe there's been fairly minimal tribal involvement. Pilar Thomas, former deputy secretary for the Office of Indian Energy, has been working with several tribes and kind of following that proceeding and working with some tribes and providing some input on that. And I'm sure there's others out there that I'm not aware of, but there's so many rulemaking proceedings going on, and it's very challenging for tribes to be able to provide meaningful, not even just provide meaningful input, but just keep their finger on the pulse of these things whatsoever. So I think in the SCHIP realm, that was also the case as well. There was some specific language with tribes and disadvantaged communities and kind of addressing their needs in a specific manner. And I participated, or I supported Rincon, Paul, and San Pasquale in submitting some comments or participating in some of those proceedings to a certain degree about some specific kind of needs and opportunities. And I as far as I could tell, it didn't go much more beyond that. And so it's challenging for tribes to be able to help shape these opportunities in a way that are going to address and help their need and help their communities get to where they want to be in terms of resiliency and beyond. So in terms of resiliency planning and projects, the general resources and practices for tribes, at least those that I work with, I find that these tend to be grant-driven projects, and these grant projects are more successful and have more uptake when they don't involve a match requirement. The BIA has a resilience program grant opportunity. It's more recent. I think that really started appearing maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I think there's a significant, a pretty good number of tribes that are taking advantage of that opportunity on an ongoing basis for adaptation and resiliency planning, which can cover energy needs and beyond. So I think a lot of times it can start there with kind of general planning. Ideally, working with the tribe, we'd start more generally in terms of like, being able to identify and do kind of in line with what the 4-pillar methodology promotes, which I believe is mostly in line with good planning practices, starting with a baseline assessment, identifying where the needs are across the board, but using that process to then identify and isolate the specific priority projects and opportunities and needs to then go deeper and do some advanced planning. And so I think, that's what the 4-pillar methodology then seeks to do as well, is it, starts with the baseline assessments, and then it moves on into the specific mitigation measure assessment opportunity. And so, we'll work with tribes on advanced planning or feasibility studies for various resiliency projects, microgrid projects, and beyond. And I'll have some examples coming up of these. Sometimes those feasibility studies, go quite a ways to then maybe be a bridge to finding and securing funding for those projects to move forward, but sometimes they just don't go far enough to kind of bridge that gap. And there's a certain amount of pre-development work that needs to occur, or additional analysis that needs to occur as well. With respect to the 4 pillars, that's one thing, providing some feedback on that as I'm going through this right now. I think the planning is a bit, has to be iterative. So in doing your baseline assessments, you don't want to spend all day of evaluating and going too far in evaluating every need and opportunity, particularly when the tribe already has a sense of where its specific needs are and where its priorities are. So, I find that I find sometimes I have more success in working on these projects and working with tribes and being responsive to tribal needs when, I can be adaptable and flexible to focus in on working on where those needs have been identified, even if they haven't gone through the kind of full rigors of the analysis, to be able to continue to work on and advance those needs while simultaneously going back to that broader planning process. And that also tends to better engage tribes and leads to less, I think, general assessments or general planning processes ending up on a shelf collecting dust, is when they have some immediate applicability in addressing some high priority needs. And so, then moving from that advanced planning to really that hurdle, then identifying and securing the funding for implementation, for the tribe to evaluate if they have their own resources, whether they can invest or how much they can invest and what other funding opportunities are out there. And then also, how they can secure these opportunities. Do they need to bring in other resources? They need to bring in a grant writer. They need to bring in other support to get them to where they need to go to secure the funding, and then also to manage it and complete that project. Do they have the internal capacity? Do they have the external partnerships and resources as well? So I just want to talk about, highlight a few projects or a few needs. This project was taken outside from the admin building of Paula, I think last week or the week before, where their environmental director saw Gregory Mountain on fire. And this is an ongoing, an increasing issue in throughout California, as wildfires are just cropping up so easily everywhere. And are driving these types of projects. Another kind of picture and video from Paula is flooding that's occurring, impacting the entire community at so many levels. And here's another picture from just. Yes, I don't know if you were hearing the audio or not on that, but so we're supporting the tribe not just on their energy needs, but also addressing wildfire, flood opportunities as well. It's working with Paula. We're working with them on kind of broader national, regional, national capacity building in addressing these types of needs, doing the resilience and climate and energy planning processes. But we've also been working with Paula on addressing their needs from their community and continuing to adapt. So we started off with a broader adaptation plan and that initially had maybe more of a health focus. We secured some Caltrans funding to then do one with a transportation focus. We've secured FEMA funding to do some advanced planning to address flood needs. And so this is a map from the reservation that shows a snapshot model from a simulated event. That may have been the same one that the picture was from, that show when the water, when the flood event occurs, and it just fans out across the reservation, covering roads. And there's only, I believe, 3 ways out of the reservation, and these flooding events are cutting the community off. Not just cutting off their power access, but literally cutting them off from leaving the reservation on a main road or any road. This picture's from San Pasqual, and we supported them on getting some funding to address some a landslide that occurred as a result of an extreme storm event a few years ago as well. And so these issues are across the board, and there's a certain level of depth that you need to be able to go into to be able to address everything adequately. So when tribes have one person and very limited resources, it's very difficult for them to address these myriad of challenges. And so even just addressing something that's going to energy, where it's perhaps more easy to quantify the economic impacts and potentially more funding out there, it's hard for tribes that are spread so thin to even focus enough on those issues and opportunities. I've been involved and continue to be involved in microgrid projects for these three tribes and beyond. And so this is one that the San Pasqual Tribal Microgrid Complex project should be commissioned and activated hopefully within the next month or so. And this is at their main government campus. Includes 7 different meters, 7 or 8 different facilities, integrating all these facilities together with solar and storage, but that also is going to offset their full electric load. It's actually including some new electric vehicle charging stations as well. And these are complicated projects. There's complicated jurisdictional challenges. The San Pasqual is working with SDG&E, trying to go through the interconnection processes to get approval, trying to work with them to get upgraded electrical infrastructure that can support a fully integrated single campus system on a single meter, as opposed to all these separate individual facilities that otherwise can't utilize centralized distributed energy resources. And so, we're still working through those processes to kind of get there. And, at the end, it's just like, even hung up right now on some approvals on some equipment when the CEC kind of did some refresh and required all the inverter providers and others to kind of refresh their certifications or something like that. So I'm not quite as on the ground on this project as I was in the initial phases of this, but excited to see this project go active soon. At Rincon, we have the fire station microgrid we're working on, one for the government center, and then a very large one, complex one for the resort campus, and which includes not just the resort, but wastewater treatment plant and their travel plaza, so gas station and convenience store. And so this project involves existing solar, new solar, existing storage, and new storage in the form of lithium ion, as well as kind of more emerging non-lithium ion technologies in the form of flow battery and flywheel energy storage systems, new and existing diesel generators, and just a very complex project. And we are dealing with some of the things that were raised when Will was talking with respect to dual taxation and how do we navigate that? How do we avoid that as much as possible? The advantage of this project is this facility is going to just serve the tribal community, whereas if it was a utility scale project that was primarily just generating energy going back into the grid and not strictly used within the community, then those dual taxation issues would probably be potentially insurmountable based on the current path we're moving forward with this project. And then more recently, looks like secured an award for Paula through a DOE grant for a series of solar plus storage microgrids for critical government facilities throughout the reservation. And so I led the grant proposal for Paula on this project, and I've had a lot of success in pursuing and securing DOE funding as well as CEC and other grant funding for a lot of these projects. And that's actually how I find and initially bring value to tribes, is being able to secure a significant amount of grant funds to support these projects. And again, it kind of then snowballs in a way for the tribes who can get over that initial hurdle and get that ball rolling, and then is more challenging for those tribes who can't. But I also I wasn't involved in a project for another tribe. I did a little bit of advising on a grant proposal for another tribe for microgrid system, and in this case it was a tribe that didn't have a large gaming facility that wasn't successful in a grant proposal, and I didn't actually work on that grant application. And so I think it just goes to Will's point. It's certainly there are the haves and the have-nots. There are fewer tribes with more resources that can kind of take advantage of these opportunities, and so things like the match requirement with the DOE, it being a 50-50 cost share, and other ones that incentivize or provide more scoring points for match contributions. Well, the tribes that need this as much, if not much more than the communities that have these revenue streams, I just can't seem to take advantage of those opportunities. So I think Will did a great job of kind of breaking down the four pillar methodology. I didn't pull it up. I'm going to just actually pull over one of the slides that Roseanne shared with me to kind of go through, and I have some notes on the side to kind of walk through just some considerations, my perspective. So I also want to provide the caveat that I'm working with these tribes and representing the tribes on a variety of projects in this particular forum. I'm not necessarily representing these tribes on their perspectives on the four pillar methodology, and so kind of do my please keep that in mind, obviously. But I do my best to kind of highlight what I see as both the value and the potential drawbacks. So, I mean, I mentioned the methodology itself, I believe, is consistent with good planning practices and good planning process. Getting down through baseline assessment to mitigation measure. Again, how far do you go? Moving on to resiliency scorecard, a tribe's scoring criteria is definitely going to be different than the CPUCs in applying the methodology themselves. And certainly, I think the framework itself needs to be customizable and adaptable, and not just tribes, any community needs to have the discretion to be able to apply, develop and apply their own scoring criteria for valuing the impacts of the potential mitigation measures. And then just making sure that's an iterative process as well, because any community, a tribal community or beyond, is only going to have, can only go so far with the resources and go, in evaluating these opportunities. So at some point, there's going to have to, kind of draw a line in the sand for how far they can go for everything across the board, and have to do some advanced planning for certain opportunities. So, and also reviewing some of the resources that the CPUC have shared on this before, just, some questions for me is, how easy will it be to use? How flexible? What are the implications from deviating from the methodology in terms of accessing funding or resources? To the extent that this tool is really trying to facilitate investments by the CPUC and other agencies in the opportunities that are identified. I think that certainly would be consideration for a tribe, and whether or not or how they would want to participate. But there certainly could still be value in using the methodology just as a guide, and use it however they may. reviewing what's been developed so far, it's definitely very granular, and there's significant amounts of required data that not necessarily required, but there's a lot of data that I see in there and what's being developed that in some cases just isn't going to exist for a tribal community, and that's not necessarily unique to tribes, and but it's going to be definitely different across the board for tribes and what level of data they have to feed the methodology and the model, and also to consider that tribal leaders and tribal representatives are spread thin. Getting sufficient buy-in and participation in the methodology is going to be challenging as well. Will mentioned traditional indigenous knowledge. To what extent does this methodology allow for consideration and incorporation of the traditional knowledge that tribes have that guide their decisions, and also protects the sensitivity of that knowledge and the information they have that isn't not necessarily something that they want to be out in the public. I think that it would be great. I think I see some value in what's being developed and provided, and scrolling through and seeing some of these spreadsheets. They touch upon important considerations for tribal communities, and I, as somebody who works with tribes on these types of planning processes, I would love to see customizable templates available to use on my own, whether or not I participate formally in the process, or just to be able to use that also include lists of potential loads or targets, metrics, hazards, mitigation options, scoring factors, and other things that can kind of just be plopped in. So, we're not having to necessarily reinvent the wheel, but also being able to customize it, add, remove or add what is applicable to each unique tribal community. I think that, whether or how tribes want to participate in the methodology is going to depend upon their level of trust. Tribes have varying degrees in the level of trust in working with the state agencies and others. There can be concerns regarding the waiver of tribal sovereign immunity in terms of partnering with the state and taking advantage of resources. Tribes' own resources and capabilities to actually utilize the tool, the ability to engage stakeholders, involve stakeholders in the process. So their commitments, the available information and data already mentioned, the flexibility or discretion in how the tool, methodologies and resources will be used, and then just the potential benefits. What is utilizing this methodology going to do to support tribes and get to where they want to go? Will it facilitate their access to resources they otherwise wouldn't have access to? Are those, how is decision making going to be around accessing those resources? Is there going to be a certain level of tribal commitment that's needed, a match requirement to access the resources that are made available? If this will kind of facilitate access to resources too, and then also to consider who is and who should the CPUC be targeting to use the tool. I think primarily those who are doing the resiliency planning for tribes, the internal staff, and those outside consultants and others that are involved in the process, and leadership, to the extent that they're involved in this process as well. In terms of really kind of working with them, getting their buy-in and feedback on the tool and its value methodology and approach. So some other recommendations in the kind of development and pre-deployment phase of the 4 pillars methodology that I have for the CPUC was researching and reviewing pre-existing relevant tribal feedback and information on relevant topics. Working on the gap analysis project, I know the CEC has been working in the space a little bit to identify needs and opportunities. There have been was a tribal summit. There was a few years ago. There was the California Tribal Energy Resilience conference, and I know what the CPUC sought to gain some feedback. There have been various meetings and other things that they've done to gather this data. as well. And then the gap analysis itself hopefully will help to inform this tool and other resources that the state are seeking to deploy in this space. Making efforts to do outreach to tribes with tribal specific content. I see a lot of workshops, similar workshops being done right now for tribal input in a lot of different areas. EPIC has their EPIC plan. They're seeking input on that for resources and trying to get tribal input. CCI. I'm drawing a blank right now. I know what that stands for, but the Climate Investments Initiative is, seeking tribal input on the investment plan. Recently I participated in an SDG&E workshop where they were seeking, tribal and other feedback and involvement, but in a lot of cases that those are kind of general workshops. I think more tribal specific workshops would be more beneficial in listening sessions. Being able to identify where tribes are going and bring the information resources to them. And also at the same time, identify and share information about current opportunities. I mean, I'm working in the space. I'm about as tapped, in touch with the grant and other opportunities that are out there. But I still am not aware of all the resources, and I'm, learning through the gap analysis project. We're trying to develop a database as comprehensive as possible and make that available to tribes of all the existing opportunities to help them in the space of clean energy, climate change, adaptation, and resilience. And then moving into deploying the 4 pillars methodology, and I don't know to what extent there are specific plans for this providing access to resources, but it would be great if I think the tribes that I work with would be familiar if there was, it was similar to like a grant opportunity for resiliency planning. I'm sure the amount of resources that are going to be available for the CPUC in addressing the needs identified and valuing the specific actions they want to take to address the resiliency needs for tribes and other communities is going to be limited, and using some pre-established criteria to identify and select the best candidates. Hopefully they're not being a match requirement, and then allowing tribes who are able to secure this funding to lead this process without inflexible requirements for using the 4 pillars methodology. So allowing them to use the planning processes that work best for them, using the 4 pillars methodology as much as possible, in line with their interests and how it works for them. And then for the successful planning to then lead to funding for implementation as well. So there be the eligibility for funding, the eligibility to apply for funding, or at least increasing the odds of the implementation funding if that ever becomes available for programs that are directly related to the 4 pillar methodology or other CPUC related programs, such as the funding being available, made available through Microgrids proceeding. Okay, so thanks everybody. That's the end of my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to you, Roseanne and Jessica.
Thanks so much, Josh. We have one question from Rob Peterson that was answered by Will. I'll just read it for those of you that are calling in. In what ways does an energy shed differ from a microgrid? It came up several times in Will's slides. How does the energy shed concept